Can you hear me? We put a speaker on every week, a different subject. We require a speaker to take a position on an issue or express a point of view that has to be for or against something. We don't care what it is. We give an hour to make a presentation. If anybody interrupts the speaker, we remind the interrupter we listen only one fool at a time. It's one of our rules. Then we have questions and answers from the audience of the speaker, not speeches. Then we have remarks, rebuttals. Everybody in the audience that wants to gets 5 minutes at the podium here to respond to the speaker said for or against. Our speaker gets the last word, gets a comment, to close the meeting. But before we introduce our speaker, we have time for announcements. Does anybody have any announcements they want to make? Now's the time to do it.
I got one.
Here comes someone.
All right. Dallas Philosophy Forum is starting up its fall season at a Boca's restaurant on the southwest corner of Central and Beltline in Richardson. And we'll be meeting on September 10th. And the first talk is about privacy and the dangers of corporate knowledge. So you have concerns about Google getting all your information on Facebook and sharing it with people. This will be about that. So you might want to participate in that discussion.
Any other announcements? Jan, you got any announcements you want to make?
Well, we
Come on up here. It helps if you get up
Who's
here.
the birthday boy?
I know, there's a birthday
And
boy.
we'll have cake after.
Yeah.
A couple little cakes.
All right.
She's the far member.
Okay. And any other announcements? Now's the time. Get it out of your system if you have announcements. Okay. Our speaker next week is Jian Li. He's going to talk about solving the crisis in America today. It's on your itinerary. I'm not going to read all this. August 31st, we're closed. It's holiday. It's Labor Day weekend. Traditionally, everybody leaves town, so we don't want to hold a meeting and have no one here. So September 7th, how low can he go? That's Carol Donovan, chair of the Democratic Party. She'll be here talking about that. She's talking about Trump, how low he can go. That'll be interesting. What was that?
She went yay for Carol.
Oh, all right. And September 14th is Brain Health in American Medical Crisis. That's Dr. Daniel Hurley. He's going to talk about that. It's on your itinerary. Again, I'm not going to read all this. On September 21st, on the battle with the IRS, Ken Sauter, he's sitting right here. He'll be our speaker there. And again, I'm not going to talk about all this. You can read it. It's on your itinerary.
I'll have plenty to say.
He says he'll have plenty to say. So anyway, our speaker tonight is Jian Li. I think I said Jian correctly. All right. And she's a PhD in anthropology and a Mandarin teacher. She's going to discuss the understandings and misunderstandings of the concept of racial ideas and racism, based on the theories of anthropology, genetics, and her own personal experience and reflections. She argues that our concept of race is outdated. She contends that we need to re-examine the concept of race and racism so we can be the agents of social equality and justice. So without further ado, please give a very, very warm welcome to Jian Li.
Good evening. My name is Jian Li. Jian Li. And my topic.
No, I call it Jian.
Yes.
Giant Li.
It's like sounds like J-A-N. Jian. I don't expect you to pronounce it like Chinese, so the closest is like J-A-N. Jian. Jian. But I just
They know about
Jian
that.
is fine. And the topic is reflections on the concepts of race, racial ideas, and racism. Some 20 years ago, I was teaching anthropology at the College of Charleston. And as a fledgling academics, I had to publish. And I had a colleague who worked in the South Carolina Historical Society. And he suggested I do some research and write a paper about the history of Chinese in Charleston. When I started, I didn't know anything really. I didn't know too much, let's say, about race and racism in the US, but as I was doing research, I learned a lot about the history of race and racism in the United States. And I also realized that the topic was not only for historical records, but it also helps us for a better understanding of the racial ideas and the racism of today. So first, I'm going to talk about what I learned about history of Chinese in Charleston, South Carolina. It's a very interesting topic because historically, we think about race in terms of white and black. And in Charleston, when I did research, there was a very small population of Chinese in Charleston, and there was nothing written about this group. So I started like from a scratch. How did I start from scratch? You know, South Carolina and Charleston in particular is very conscious of its history. So they have like archival materials, city directories dating back to 1880s, and census data dating back to 1800s. So I went to the library, I went to the archival materials and looked through the city directories and census data and tried to find out what would the Chinese be perceived and treated in a black and white environment. In South Carolina, Charleston in particular, between say early 1900s to 1980s. Mostly kind of like before 1965, where the segregation was the rule of the land at that time. And I was interested in finding out if Chinese were considered as black or white. Their children, did they go to white school or black schools? So as I was doing this research, the first thing that I did, like, I have to get historical records. And then I try to find descendants of the Chinese immigrants. It was not easy, but slowly I got as much information as I could. So the very beginning, say the directories of Charleston population. In most cases in Charleston, the Chinese names are put in the white section. How many of you have watched the movie Green Book? Green Book? Yes, it's a really, really good movie. If you haven't watched it, I highly recommend it. So the Green Book is the book had the directories for African American businesses. If they had to find a accommodation, restaurant or hotel, they had to find like black-owned business. They were not allowed, right? So it was kind of interesting to think like where would Chinese fit into a very biracial system. So in most cases, the Chinese population was very small in Charleston, and in most cases, they were listed in white section of Charleston directory. In most cases, when they died, they were put in the cemeteries for white. But they are also regarded as kind of second, like second-class citizens. So in order to go deeper to this question, we have to talk about the Jim Crow laws. How many of you know about Jim Crow laws? Half of, or more than half of you know the Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow laws were enacted in the 80s, 70s, and the 80s till around 1965, the Civil Rights Movement, by the U.S. Supreme Court. The Jim Crow laws mandated racial segregation in all public facilities. If you like watch the Green Book, the movie, it's very visual to tell you like blacks were not allowed to go to the bathroom at restaurants where white people would go, and the law itself was considered as like they are separate but equal. But in reality, if separation was true but equal was not true. The kind of facilities that African Americans will go to is not at the same level as the white people will go. So because of the Jim Crow laws, everything, even like the city directories, phone directories, had a black section and had a white section. And there were years when a few Chinese might be included in a colored section, but mostly is in the white section. In terms of marriage, so because of the Jim Crow laws, it was forbidden for African American to marry a Caucasian woman. So what about Chinese? There are very few. So probate court documents, I was able to find there were 3 marriages between Chinese men and an Irish woman, and also there are Chinese men who married mulatto, brown, mixed races, all African American. So they are kind of like outside the Jim Crow laws. They were able to marry either black or mulatto or white. In few cases. The most interesting case that I found was I was trying to see if a full Chinese child, what kind of schools would this child go? White school or black school? And the descendants of Chinese men and a Caucasian woman, or Chinese man and a mulatto woman, what kind of schools would the kids go? So it was, it looks like if a Chinese man married a Caucasian woman, the kids are more likely to go to white school. But if a Chinese man married a mulatto, a brown, or a black, will go to a black school. So by the end, I found there was a like pure Chinese, like both father and mother were Chinese, and I was excited to learn like what school would this child go to, and and I was able to locate a person. I had a name. His name was Robert Miller, because he was adopted by a couple. The father, his biological parents were Chinese, but his biological parents decided to go back to China, so he was adopted by a couple, and the couple, one of them was white, one of them was Chinese. So when I located him and interviewed him, which school did you go to? And he said, I didn't go to school. And I said, why you didn't go to school? He said, oh, my parents said I was sickly, and they decided to tutor me or ask tutor to come to our house. So that's a story that was told to him, and he believed that story. As my interview with other people, including a lady who was like almost 80 years old, and she was a Caucasian, and then she said, oh, I remember Robert Miller, and he used to go to like primary school with us, but once like when we were deciding maybe middle school or something, and she said her memory was like, she said they used to play together, but then because he was Chinese, he was not allowed to go to white school, but his parents wanted to protect him from knowing he was being rejected because he was Chinese. So his parents never told him and just say like, oh, he was not in good health, so they had a tutor for him, and he never went to school. So that was that story. And then there was another interesting story of later, the Chinese population was very small, and there was there are few families of Chinese men who married African American women, and their children, some children have darker skin and some children have lighter skin. You probably have heard like passing. So for the lighter skin, let's say African Americans or other mixed race, sometimes they try to pass as white. So there was this family I interviewed. They had like cousins, nephews, nieces, and most of them like self-identification as African American, and there were good private schools for African Americans, but they were not allowed to go to white school. And there was a family of mixed Chinese and African, and the kids were very light-skinned. So in order to go to the white school, the family decided to change their identity. And one way of changing identity is they made a decision not to go to the same church, not to live in the same neighborhood with other relatives. And they also changed their last name to be kind of different. So the other cousins and families, their last name was Lum, L-U-M, and they changed to L-E-M. And they identified themselves as Chinese, and they learned Chinese language, and they was also doing some interpretation of Chinese and English. So after they changed their identity, the next year the kids were able to go to white school, and we found like school records. So it's not a story like I have records. But after like 8 months, the school got a call from someone else who said like some of their relatives were actually attending black school, so they are not really like Chinese. And after they were like tipped by that information, they were discharged from the white school. So that part of history, before I started to do this study, it was like all forgotten. But then I found descendants and talked to them, and they, so we got a picture of like what the southern states were like during that time. So I'm going to read short conversation. So the family tried to passing as white, as Chong Lam made a determined effort in redefining his and his children's ethnicity in order to be assimilated into the white world because of the segregation laws, which made second-class citizens of blacks. The fact that children with the Chinese identities could then attend a white school was just another benefit of the crossing over. So if you studied like Southern history, there's this crossing over concept. And that's actually, the sentence was said by Ruth Eagle, one of the nieces of Chong Lam family. Chinese children were both rejected and accepted by various white schools in other southern states. So I did some research and reading about how other southern states were doing at that time. For example, in Savannah, Chinese children were not allowed to go to white schools before 1920, but they were accepted by white schools starting in the mid-1920s. In Mississippi, Greenwood was perhaps the first large system to admit Chinese in the late 1930s. So different states at different time, they accepted and rejected Chinese children into white school, but it's much earlier than the desegregation, total desegregation. That will be late 1960s and some places 70s, right? The social status of the Chinese in Charleston also depended on the socio-economic status. There was another group of Chinese in Charleston, and Charleston has a citadel, a respected kind of like West Point, right? Citadel is almost like West Point. So yeah, the citadel, they accepted like about 20 Chinese students from China, and they were very well received because they were from aristocratic families in China, and they made good friends with kind of like middle or upper middle class white in Charleston. Between 1920 and 1932, at least 6 Chinese cadets attended the Citadel as international students. These students had scholarships awarded by the Chinese government. Coming from a gentry class and with an excellent educational background, the Chinese cadets were well received. And in a yearbook, they described one of the Chinese cadets. It's a kind of interesting description, so I'm going to read it from the yearbook. Coming from distant climes, Anne, that's a name, has been quite fortunate in assimilating so readily the customs and habits of the West in general and of the Citadel in particular, a thing which a good number of native South Carolinians have been unable to do. And his fortune has been quite favorable in his academic year. And then they have something particular, for neither the awe-inspiring Major Williams nor the equally terrible Tip dare lower themselves to the level of a cadet by admitting that occasionally they fail to understand the full content of his recitation. Our only hope is that if his native country ever enters into a conflict with ours, with General Anne as their leader, his good fortune will not be quite so consistent. And there was a club called the Da Tong Club. Da Tong is a Chinese name like for utopia. and they have a salon, and in that salon the Chinese cadets and some kind of like high class Charlestonians, they communicated and they had very good relationship. And one of the letters from one of the students said, I recall the friendship we have cultivated in our club is sacred or ideal one because there's no other motive behind it except mutual understanding and mutual appreciation, since we are all the oppressed people of the Wall Street or Nanking. That was the seat of the Chinese government at that time. We are more or less created equal. For this reason, in our club, we forget that we are all either Americans or Chinese. We are only conscious that we are intimate friends. No artificiality, no prejudice, but naturalness and affinity. I wish that I could be present in every meeting of our club to enjoy a great friendship and to learn everything you will teach me. Long live the Datong Club, and Merry Christmas to you all. So this group of students, they were more readily accepted because they were from aristocratic families in China, and there was no, and they were in a very protected environment. I'm going to skip some of the details of this group of students. Asked if the Chinese cadets were treated differently because they were Chinese, Mrs. Hart replied, only poor whites, ignorant people might have treated them differently. As far as I know, they were treated as whites. Although the Chinese in the laundry, so most Chinese other families, they were engaged in the laundry business. Although the Chinese in the laundry were probably treated as second class. The Chinese cadets were well received in Charleston because they were highly educated and were believed to have come from very aristocratic, very well-to-do, and very influential families in China. To sum up, the social status of the Chinese in a biracial system is not clearly defined because there was such a small Chinese population in Charleston before the 1960s. The different experiences of Chinese laundrymen and the Chinese cadets reflected a society divided by racial and class lines. Interviews with the Charleston's older residents indicated that the Chinese as a group had cordial relations with local residents, indicating that Chinese as a group, they had good relations with the local residents, but they were rather withdrawn from the outside world. One African-American woman in her 80s recalled that Chinese laundrymen were clannish, partly because their language barrier, partly because they had long hours of working, so they stayed like within small clannish. And they were friendly enough towards everyone. They treated everyone well, blacks or whites. They did their work beautifully. They have their own customs, but they didn't bother anyone else. Although those Chinese who worked in laundry business got along well with the local residents, they were loners with little social life, since many did not speak English well and had long working hours. The Chinese cadets, on the other hand, attended the Citadel, an elite institution, were treated as international students who were outside the segregation system. So that's the kind of historical study I did some 20 years ago. Now I'm coming back to examine the race concept. Sometimes we use the race concept without thinking too much about it. Sometimes we say ethnicity, sometimes we say race. So I want to pause for a moment and to have you to think about your race. So if you were asked about what's your race, how would you respond? Anyone?
I try not to answer. I try not to answer that question, even on medical.
Okay.
I don't like.
African American.
Okay.
So.
Okay.
African American.
African American and African American and who wants, like, if you were asked about your race, how would you say? Yes.
Internationalist.
Internationalist. Okay.
I say none of your business.
Okay. So do I have another one? Yes.
Okay, so, I mean, people don't ask me, I guess they
Yeah.
just assume I'm white, just
Yeah.
regular white.
Right.
But I'm also, besides Caucasian,
Yeah.
because the definition of race is
Yeah.
we're bound by our genes,
Yeah.
G-E-N-E-S.
Okay.
Right.
So, I'm also Jewish.
Okay.
So, I'm
Okay.
both, I'm both
Okay.
Caucasian and Jewish.
Okay. Caucasian and Jewish. Yes.
Jews are
That's right.
Yeah.
Also a race.
Well, it's okay. It's self-identification. Yes.
Race because we're bound by
Yes.
our genes.
Jews are not a race.
That's okay. And
However,
yes.
somebody that is Hispanic or black can
Yeah.
convert and become a Jew, but a Jew can never become, if they are a white Jew, brown or black.
Yeah.
Right.
As a race or ethnicity. So
Yeah.
Yeah.
Judaism to me is a religion, although
Yeah.
it has cultural and racial
Yeah.
characteristics.
But it
Yeah.
also has,
Yeah.
we're also
Okay.
bound by the genes.
Okay. Okay. Yes. This gentleman in front. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Years ago, when I was just enrolled in a new school in the graduate department, University of Texas at San Antonio. And two guys ahead of me in a crowd of about 50 behind me, and the guys in front said, "What are you going to put down here?"
Yeah.
And asked for the race.
Yeah.
And I said, "I'm putting Occidental." Everyone in line put Occidental on the bunch.
Okay.
About 6 weeks later, the registrar of the school, Mr. Lewis, called me into his office. He says, "Brent, you're a troublemaker." He's smiling. I said, "Yeah." He said, "We got something from Miles Schultz in Dallas, Director of Post-Secondary Education for Health Education and Welfare, wanting to know who these Occidentals are." He said, "Don't put Occidental down again." So, of course, the next time, everybody lists themselves as Jewish Texans.
Jewish Texans.
Yeah. They're in the line, and I get a call 3 weeks later. I had to go see Mr. Lewis. He's laughing. He says, "Mr. Schultz in Dallas, he's a lawyer. He don't get it." He said, "Don't put that down either." So the next time, we all just put down native Texans. And again, the next thing, the University of Texas got a letter demanding to know what subgroup and what sub-ethnicity
Yeah.
the native Texans were, and why the school had discriminated and only had native Texans and no one else as students. So this can play, you know, I'm a former president of the North Texas Asian Agricultural Association. I was a vice president for years. I've been active in Asian events here and the cultures. And what I see now, the Leave It to Beaver atmosphere pervades the Asian American community. Most have nice homes, the kids do well in school, but when you go shopping to the grocery store, it's going to be over on Adelia Road at the Hong Kong Marketplace or the Chinatown or over on Josie Lane. And the same thing with Hispanics. Most of them are in the Fiesta.
Right.
And
So,
So that's beyond my question.
No,
We can talk
I
about
know
this.
that.
So my question
But is
is
it-
your
is it-
identification of yourself.
is it really beyond the issue?
No, we are going to have a question answer, and
Okay.
any question is fair. But
There
right
you-
now, we are focusing on race.
I understand.
Your self-identification. We'll come back. Okay. Yes, back. Yeah, back. Yes. Self-identification.
Get the microphone. Who are you?
My name is Horace Blake, and I know these guys with the Texas Alliance of Retired American. Great subject, ma'am, and I follow along with a lot of what you have said because I studied at UNT Graduate School, and one of my primary courses was race and ethnicity. And so oftentimes people don't think about their race simply because they're so comfortable in their group, so there's never ever a need to mention it.
Yeah.
However, when you're outside that group, you know, it's always coming to question. So for myself, I consider myself black, and if you ask black from where, then I could give you some breakdown. Runaway African slaves who are called maroons, and then from there on, it's a generous mixed marriage of Germans and Scottish. So if you see my family, it's a whole combination of people. And then some went off to marry Chinese, and then some went off to marry Indians. And the reason for that, in the West Indies, when slavery was abolished, they brought in the Chinese and the Indians as indentured servants. So eventually there were not enough women to go around, so certainly they kind of meander into other races. And it worked quite well, you know, and that's all I have for now.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So my question is like to help us to reflect this race concept, and I have like more things to talk about later. So one last one, okay. So yeah, you want? Okay, so we will have a question and answer session after my talk, and you can ask me any questions. I may or may not be able to answer, but right now I want to continue my talk. So my background is in anthropology, so I'm going to kind of introduce the history of the concept, and we'll talk a little bit difference between race and ethnicity. Anthropologists have long debated the implications of the concept of race. Historically, the concept of race implies different races have different inheritable traits that include both biological and cultural traits. By 1930s, the concept of inheritable traits has been challenged by many anthropologists, notably by Franz Boas. And Boas is often considered the father of American anthropologists. His work, and that goes back to 1930s, that anthropologists started to re-examine the concept. His work put an emphasis on cultural and environmental effects on people instead of biological traits. It is said that before Boas, anthropology was the study of race, and after Boas, anthropology was the study of culture. Since 1930s, especially with the rise of Nazism and the systematic persecution of genocide of the Jewish people based on the superiority of the Aryan race, anthropologists have been critical of the use of the concept of race. However, the word race has entered the common vernacular in such a way that it has been used by both people on the streets and the government, such as in the census, still ask about race, without being fully aware of its limitations, biases, and unintended consequences. In the United States, a popular definition of race is based on skin color, usually along the line of white and black. In reality, there's hardly any pure race. Most, if not all of us, are mixed heritage. If you have done a genetic testing from Ancestor.com, National Geographic, there's a 23.com. Anyone has done any genetic testing? Only 2 of you did? Did you, more? Yeah, more. So in your genetic testing, did you find like your family is more than one race?
No.
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 It's more than one?
Oh, no, I'm just one race.
One race.
But I'm Jewish, and I did find out I have Swedish ancestors.
Swedish ancestors.
Yeah, but that's all.
And there are many genetic testings that reveal some, like Caucasians, they have actually African American genes along in their family lines. Yes?
My third cousin did that genetic testing, and she discovered that in my family we're 1% black.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So how far back does that go?
Yes. Does it? Uh-huh.
Me and my brother took the test. We found out we're not mixed race, we're mixed species. We have Neanderthals.
That's way back.
Yeah.
Wow. Which tests did you take?
That
gave
23.
you 23.
Yeah.
Okay, 23.com was pretty good. I was told. Okay. So in most cases, like probably I would say like 80% cases. If you take a test, you'll find like you have different ancestors. Well, there are very few so-called pure race. Now let's consider what the race of a person born of parents of different races. For example, one European and one African. Take President Obama, for example. He was born to a white mother and a black father. His mother, Anne Durham,
I knew Bill Clinton was really the first black president. Now you confirmed it.
Okay, so this is not my topic right now. So we know for sure Obama's identity, right? Okay, so we'll just keep on with Obama for now. So we know for sure Obama's identity because it's quite public information. So his mother is white and has German, Irish, Scottish, Swiss, Welsh ancestry. And his mother actually is a PhD in anthropology, and she did anthropological work. His father, Barack Obama Sr., was Kenyan, Kenya. So genetically, Obama had half and half, right? So, but ethnically, Obama actually is more white than black. You know why? Because he only spent less than 1 year with his father. His father went back to Kenya shortly after he was born, and his mother was busy doing anthropology field work. So he was raised basically by his grandparents. And his grandparents were white, right? Was Irish and German heritage, and it was raised in Hawaii. So ethnically, his background actually was more white than black. However, our media always call him like first black African American president. But you really think about it genetically, culturally, at least half and half, but culturally, actually, he was educated more within white folks. But why we consider Obama as black? So if you go back to the historically, there is a theory of one drop of blood. And that one drop of blood theory goes like, even if you have one drop of blood of like, say 10% of African, you are considered as black. And one of the theories that explain this one drop rule is that at that time, the South needed more slaves to work on the farm. So by having one drop rule, they expand the black population to work on a southern plantation. But even though today most people like even may not know, and we don't think that way, but seriously, we call a mixed race person more likely to call either as like black, African, or person of color. So that's this part of the way that we think. Now I'm going to be a little bit more personal. Being an Asian American, I have never considered myself either as white or black. Many years ago, I was visiting Bahamas and I was asked to fill in a form. One of the questions asked on the form was to check the box black or white. I was baffled and I didn't know how to choose. A native Bahamas man, he look at me and said, of course you are white. On the other hand, Asians are classified officially as people of color in America. The label often makes me uncomfortable. If I am a person of color, does it simply mean I'm not white? What is the opposite of person of color? People of colorless. So does it mean white people are colorless while everyone else is a person of color? So it's a euphemism saying you are not white, right? Everyone else is a person of color. This provides another dilemma in race relations. Some people would say the solution is to be colorblind. This sounds like a good idea, but is it realistic at this moment of history when racism still is in the fabric of our society? This leads us to the next two tough questions, racial ideas and racism. There's no denying that we consciously or unconsciously hold racial ideas. And from this forum, the time I came, and sometimes like not overtly about this topic, but was like when the topic kind of came up, and I heard stereotypical views about race very popular. So for example, we assume Asian Americans are naturally talented in math and science, but not athletics, while African Americans are naturally talented in athletics, but not science and math. How about white people, Caucasians? Are they talented in all areas or some special areas? Or because since they're colorless, it is not an issue to think about their uniqueness in any particular area of strength and weakness. I like to make a distinction between racial ideas and racism. Racial ideas are the stereotypical ideas that we have about people of another ethnicity, such as black people are naturally good in basketball, white men can't jump. There's a movie called White Men Can Jump, so I thought it's a kind of stereotype, but that white man actually jumped very well, right, in the movie. Asians are naturally good in math. Jewish are very shrewd in businesses. People hold these stereotypical views of different ethnicities because they have confused the relationship between correlation and causation. It is true that there are many successful black athletes than Asian athletes. There are more Asian students that excel in math and science. There are many white lawyers than lawyers of color. They are correlations, but not of causation. Here is a distinction between correlation and causation. When we say that correlation does not imply cause, we mean that just because we can see a connection, a mutual relationship between two variables, such as Asians are good in math, African Americans are good in basketball, these are correlations, but it's different from causation. So the difference is, one is correlation does not imply cause. We mean that just because you can see the connection, mutual relationship between two variables, it doesn't necessarily mean that one causes the other. For example, we have our meetings in this Italian restaurant, and you might say, people who like this free speech forum, they like Italian food. No, not necessarily. That's a causation. So you make a connection. Sometimes people see the correlation, like we always have this meeting here, but it doesn't mean like we all like Italian food, right? So that's the difference between correlation and causation. And many people often confuse this correlation of surface phenomenon and thought it's a cause. The causes are more complex than the correlation that you see. If we truly believe that all men are created equal, then we should question the validity of stereotypical views of people of different ethnic backgrounds. So now I'm changing the words. I'm not saying race. I prefer the ethnic, because ethnic backgrounds implies more cultural differences than biological differences. The difference between people of different ethnicities are largely due to economic opportunities and cultural differences than biological differences. Although these stereotypical views of race are not scientific and can be harmful in social relations, I would not call them racism for two reasons. Almost all of us carry some kind of stereotypical views of other ethnic groups, but we still get along pretty well. And calling every stereotypical view of other groups as racism may actually deepen the mistrust of people from different backgrounds. And it may cheapen the seriousness of the concept of racism. Thus, it might be more accurate to say these are the stereotypical views of racial ideas that we should be aware of, instead of just calling racism for these kind of ideas. According to the US Civil Rights Committee, racism is any action or attitude, conscious or unconscious, that subordinates an individual group based on skin color or race. It can be enacted individually or institutionally. To put it more plainly, racism implies a power structure where those who hold power, such as in hiring or in the justice system, discriminate an individual or individuals based on race or skin color. Not like daily conversation, but rather a structural discrimination based on power. The Article 1 of Declaration of Race and Racial Prejudice, adopted by the General Conference of the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organizations, defined race as following. All human beings belong to a single species and share a common origin. They are born equal in dignity and rights, and all from an integral part of humanity. All peoples of the world possess equal faculties for attaining the highest level of intellectual, technical, and social, economic, cultural, and political development. The differences between achievements of the different people are entirely attributable to geographical, historical, political, economic, social, and cultural factors. Such differences can in no case serve as a pretext for any rank-ordered classification of nations or peoples. As someone who is trained in cultural anthropology, I fully endorse the above statement, and I would suggest that we should use ethnicity rather than race, because ethnicity implies cultural differences, whereas race implies biological differences. The use of language does matter in how we perceive the world and behave towards each other in our daily lives. Therefore, I hope you would reconsider your views about race, racial ideas, and stereotypes and racism. By being fully conscious of our own biases and prejudice, we make the first step forward towards becoming agents of social equality and social justice. Okay, I'm ready to answer questions.
Oh, that was excellent.
Hey, good, David Brennan in the house.
Yeah, let's see if this is on. It's what? Oh. Yeah, it's on, yeah. My question is, in the general broad scope of things, when you look at the commonalities as opposed to the differences. It seems that all people have similar needs, the 4 F's. They want food, fuel, fiber, and funerals. And they have the same basic needs. So when people start delving in there and trying to separate people and peel them apart and try and say, well, these people are different. Yes, it's the parents that make the difference. It's the background. We look at certain institutions in Dallas. And I just make this defining point. If you look at our city council, what groups tend to end up from our Dallas City Council in jail more often and in prison than others? No, I'm being serious. It's what people learn from their parents and their ideologies. If you take somebody, a group of 10 people from different racial ideologies, and you isolate them from their parents totally for 10 years, and you educate them the same way, you're probably going to have 10 people who are closely alike to each other than their families and their parents. You're right, race is just, it's one common term. My question is, do you really think we need to be delving into the differences as opposed to focusing more on the similarities? Everybody wants to tear the animal apart and look into it. I think maybe we ought to be going the other way, looking at the similarities. What do you think?
So, as I said, I don't think that we should use the concept of race because we are all one human race.
Amen.
Right.
Amen.
But we are like creatures of habit. So in a census, when you have to fill in the form, they expect you to write your race, right? So I suggest that there is ethnicity in terms of your cultural background. Everyone, like if you trace your family genealogy, you will find you're coming from different different nations, different backgrounds. So it's there. But there is sometimes it's historical accidents, it's just historical and cultural. So if we realize it's historical, cultural, and we can celebrate the diversity, I think one of the things that make America great is because of this diversity of immigrants and diversity of experiences that if we can unite and learn from each other, it's a strength. But if we start to bicker and fight, then it becomes an obstacle. So things, that's why I prefer ethnicity than race.
Jian,
Yes.
what is your view as it relates to the subject and to the evolutionists that would say we all started in Africa to begin with,
Yeah.
and with picking up the feet and walking north, and
Right.
so on and so forth, and
Yeah.
the environments, we obviously change skin tones
Right.
and
Yeah.
what have you. What is your view to that? And
Well,
that we all started out
yeah,
as
yeah.
black to begin with.
Right. So the archaeologists, when archaeologists are part of anthropology, archaeologists make discoveries and theories based on data. It's not just like they think about the theory. So the data is the skeletons found dating back, carbon-14 dating. So it has like hard science to back up. So the hard science that back up that, of course, science is such that we can never be 100% sure because who knows next day whatever you dig up or you don't dig up. So the best theories that we have from the archaeological data is humans Homo erectus or Homo habilis started from Africa, and there was one individual called Lucy. 2 million years ago, started in Africa, and that's the best archaeology that we have today. But in terms of theories, there are theories about like one origin from one location, or there could be multiple origins in different locations. It's all possible, but the archaeological finds, the best archaeological finds that we have today is Lucy, some 2 minutes ago from Africa. There was no earlier artifacts that we have to say otherwise.
And the second question relates to the first part of your talk, and that's with regard to the Chinese or Asian, Chinese American residents within Charleston. Did you, I don't know how many generations you were able to go back, but were any of these families at all impacted by the Chinese Exclusion Act?
My study didn't really go to that direction, but the readings I had showed that the Exclusion Act affected the immigrants from China, especially women. So there are very few Chinese men will be able to find a Chinese woman to marry because they were just not available. So they had to kind of merge with the locals.
Maybe they were affected.
Yeah, they were affected. They were not able to come. And the population, the Chinese population in Charleston was so small, so after like 60 years, they disappeared. Like you don't see Chinese anymore because they either became white or become black. And they just like disappeared because there were no Chinese women to marry, and you don't see them until after 1970s, 1980s, when the Exclusion Act was revoked, and then more like Chinese scholars, students came, and then it became another wave of immigrants. But older generation, they kind of disappeared. Yes.
Okay, my question is, how do you feel about genetic testing? Because I've seen some results and it seems so random. What's your take on it? Because someone can't be maybe some of this, maybe some of that. You know, it doesn't grab me as being authentic. So I'd like to
Well,
get your...
that's hard to say because there are so many different genetic testings. Like the ones I know, like there's Ancestor.com, there's National Geographic, there's a 23andMe. These are the three biggest. And I went to take a Ancestor.com, and the result was too general. Like 96% are Asian Pacific. Like, okay, I'm 96% of Asian Pacific, and 4% Polynesian, but I didn't know. The way that they do the genetic testing is based on the matching of the population's kind of sample. The more, like, say, the more people from England have done the testing of more people ancestor from China or Kenya, then the more accurate the result. But if the particular group, the sample size is so small, the result is not very accurate. So if more and more people participate, then they can compare and contrast. Without enough people participating, their sample doesn't give you accurate picture. I think next time if I do, I probably would do National Geographic, because it's more scientific and gives you more migration patterns of your particular group. 23 and me is more personal than population migration. Yes.
Isn't it true that the cannibal doesn't care about any of this? It's all about the seasoning?
Can you rephrase your question? I'm not sure
I don't
what
think
your
she got
question
the
is.
joke.
The cannibal doesn't care about any of these differences. It's only about the seasoning.
Well, like say for genetic testing, it's more for individual curiosity. It doesn't, like, if you're curious about your ancestors, where they come from, it just give you some clues. I don't know anything else about this.
Yeah, and it's also a more financial, profit-driven business. Recently, I think it was NPR had an emission about it, and it's based more on the region in which you're living at the moment.
Right.
And whatever the majority of the population in that area proclaims or it is really a very falsehood, and it's like insurance in America. It's based on how much they can make. And why else would National Geographic, which I believe is a nonprofit,
Nonprofit. It's
would
the
be
magazine.
involved in such a scandalous regime or attack, and be able to make so much money because they have seen how much Ancestry.com. You cannot possibly have that much of a background unless you know each of your ancestors and you know the lineage. But you can't do it on saliva.
Okay.
It's if you listen to this emission from NPR, it's very interesting.
Okay.
It's just for money.
It's just money. Just like
maybe go back to 1 or 2 generations, but after that, do the research, and then one will find. It's easy when you're a pure race,
right?
But in America, no.
Yeah. So take it as a grain of salt, right?
Yes.
Yes, Jan. Very interesting talk, but your notion of cultural backgrounds, does it? So what you're saying is different groups are more identical by their cultural and their ethnicity. Well, does that mean there's the populations different populations will actually diverge? Because culture tends to be quite local. For example, there's a Texan culture that you can tell. Actually, just as a point, when Southern people speak of what I can tell they're from Texas because their use of words is totally different from so on. So does this mean sort of anthropologically things are going to diverge or come together? Because there was a thought that the races would combine and become homogeneous totally.
I think there's a difference between so-called race, ethnicity, and culture. So in the beginning, the concept of race implies both physical and cultural differences. And the differences, not only the difference, but also inheritable. So it's obvious if you look at skin color, but it becomes an issue when you say like different races have different abilities, like the examples I give. So not every Asian kid is good in math. My daughter was good in English, but not good in math.
Your daughter is white.
But like when I was a PhD student, and the first time I heard, it took me by surprise that professor said actually the biological differences within the so-called race is not as big as like so-called inter or outer race. So apart from the skin color, like say someone who's tall, someone who's short, or have a sickle cell gene, like different kinds of like internal genetic things actually is not really associated with race. But we know everyone has a different ancestors, right? So so that's when I mentioned the anthropologists now study more cultural differences than race differences, and because when you talk about race, people usually think like, oh, they're biologically different from us. But that's kind of dangerous. They kind of like slip into racism. If you think like we are all have the same potential given the same environment, then we can do something about it. We can create better opportunities for everyone. But if you think like this group of people is just not good in math, whatever you do with them, they are not good, then you don't have to do anything. That becomes a social problem, right?
So there was a long debate about is it nature or nurture that determines a person's achievement and so on. So how do you fall on that discussion?
I remember we had a speaker last time, and I talked to him briefly. He is a doctor. I knew him. We share more or less same view. So kind of scientifically, it's hard to quantify like exact percentage of nature and culture. But from the best I know, it's not like along race line, but just as individuals. So we know like physically, if your parents are tall, you are more likely to be tall. More likely, but not 100%, right? So if you have siblings, some siblings can be tall, some can be shorter, right? But the probability is you are more likely to be tall. That's the physical aspect. But if you have multiple siblings or children, you also see that not all the siblings or children have the same temperaments or same aptitude for learning, right? So they are, even if they have same parents, and the most interesting studies are twins, identical twins. So for those, like we're not twins, we probably inherit only like 50 or 25% of parents and grandparents. So we don't really have same genes, even within the same family. But identical twins, even identical twins, they are not totally like alike, but they are more alike in terms of both physical and the temperaments and interests, and that's a fact. So they are more alike, apart of physical. So, so that means there's something that's nature, but it's not 100%. So the consensus that I know of, I recognize as like, in terms of physical nature and culture, it's probably like 70%, 70 to 30%. 70% being more alike in terms of in a family, and in terms of temperaments, I will hesitate to use the word intelligence because it's very subjective how you measure intelligence. So let's say aptitudes. In terms of aptitudes, it's probably 40-60. 40% being 40% being nature, and 60% being culture. So there is element of inheritance of personalities, right? But it's not 100%. In terms of physical, there's a higher probability of like inheritance. In terms of aptitudes and habits is less, but there's a point. There's another interesting movie, a documentary called Three Identical Strangers.
I saw that.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
that kind of tried to study the nature and culture. The three identical triplets were born to the same parents, but were raised in three different families.
Different stratas.
Different stratas. And they actually, the psychologists, did it on purpose. Wanted to know, like the triplets, if they raise in different environments, when they grow up, would they be same or different? And that was a documentary, and you can find it from like online, Three Identical Strangers, and it showed you that there are many similarities, but there were also differences.
It's a tragedy.
Yeah, it was kind of tragic by the end. Yeah, yeah.
So actually, there is also the training effect, because that can really make a mediocre person quite a good athlete just by sheer training.
Yeah.
Whereas, so that can actually outweigh natural ability in most cases.
Yeah, yeah.
And of course, it is known that the rich kids don't do that well in school because they don't need to, actually. So it's the poorer kids who often do better because they're much more motivated. So that plays into it, I think. It's like what I call the training.
It's the efforts that people make. So one of the educational theories now that says like the most important factor for children, for students to do well in school is the concept of grit. Grit. G-R-I-T, grit. Like you make determination that you want to achieve a goal. If you are determined, you are more likely to be successful than anything else. And that's kind of give us kind of encouragement as parents and as educators that we can play a role in helping children and students to achieve, no matter what their background might be.
Jian, as it relates to, let's go back, say, 50 years when America still thought of itself as white, predominantly white. This country is a polyculture, with beginnings, okay? And bit by bit, each ethnicity has been allowed to join the bigger group, okay? Based on that, and we talk about cultural growth, it's pretty unique in its formation, okay? So how do you think this country compares culturally to other countries that would call themselves white, since they tend to have stayed in their own ethnic group over time? And in fact, many of them came over here because, you know, economically it wasn't so hot where they were at. So how do you think we compare, and is it the great experiment, even though it's horrendous sometimes as to one wonders, are we really civilized?
This is too big a topic that I can really give a good answer to. If I'm able to, I can like be top, like in a top seller list, and no one can like really answer this question. But broadly speaking, I think at different times of the history, the different ethnic groups play different role and treated differently. So one characteristics of culture, last time I mentioned, is cultural change. So it really depends on which slice of history you're talking about, right? So we had slavery, we had integration, we had civil rights movement, and now we have a backlash of racism, right? So I don't want to be like too political because people have different views. I don't want to be like kind of make it kind of sound divisive, but most people can see that different times that we have different attitudes. When the economic pressure is higher, the tension is higher. So I don't know, it's kind of now there's more economic pressure, and then you kind of like, a lot of people want to find scapegoat of different groups instead of like looking at ourselves, like what we do wrong and what can we do right. We look for scapegoats of other groups of people. That's easier way to find scapegoats, right? So now there's a backlash that's kind of like I see as in a juncture of the time. On the one hand, I think there's more awareness of the need to come together, but there's also a tension. There's a tension of people of different backgrounds, right? So it's hard to predict what's going to be, and I'm afraid like when the economic situation gets tough, the so-called racial issues will flare up. If life is easy, like you don't really like question too much, but when life goes tough, people find scapegoats.
Right. But it is a different, there's a cohesiveness of culture that came out of the following culture that
I
founded
think,
this, and
yeah.
I'm just saying, which is unique compared to other
Actually, I
cultures,
think,
yet they still have
right.
maintain some of their ethnic,
Right.
cultural
yeah,
ways.
I think the immigrants, like United States is different from any other countries. It's because it's a country of immigrants, right? But of course, originally it was Native Americans, but now they don't play a role, and that's another story. But everyone, if you trace your ancestors 3-5 generations, everyone is an immigrant. And one of the characteristics of immigrants is their drive to succeed. If they didn't have the drive, they probably don't like immigrate to this country. Of course, some African Americans would not like, it was not their choice to come. They were brought up by other forces, but most other people, they came because they wanted to change their life. And if they had this drive, even the Mexicans now, like they wanted to come because they want to better their lives. They actually work very hard to better their lives, right? So the immigrants have the drive to change their work. They work hard, but after so many generations, sometimes like they don't have the same drive as the first or second generation, right? That's just true.
That's not a question, just want to share something funny with the group. People of the Middle East, and for that part actually people of North Africa, the government for some reason classifies as white.
He needs to turn it away from the speaker.
Can you hear me better now?
Yeah, good.
For some reason the government classifies as white. Everybody in the Middle East, even North Africa.
Yeah.
Egypt, this is a true story, by the way. It's funny, but it's a true story. Egypt is a very large country, and geographically it extends from the Mediterranean Sea on the north to like Central Africa on the south. And if you go back in history, even Sudan was part of Egypt. The vast majority of Egyptians are white. They look white. There are people who are brown, just like me, a little bit colored, they're not as white. But there are people deep in the south that are black. People, they are from
darker.
Black.
Yeah.
There was an Egyptian guy, he is black. He put in his application for the INS, the immigration, black. Black. Looking at his application from Egypt, Egypt should be white, Middle East. It was a problem until, it went, I don't know, but There was a big problem. When he looked white, look at him, you don't question him. You don't say he's brown, he's black. But we classify, or everybody in the Middle East, we classify as white for some. I don't know what they did about it, but I think it ended in court. That's what I said. I don't have a question. It's just
Let's break up the party.
I think we're out of questions.
Okay, very good.
Okay, I can sit down. Hello.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, now it's your turn. You get to respond to what the speaker had to say, either for or against. You got 5 minutes. Go ahead.
I enjoyed the report. Thank you for making it. You had, it was a big agenda. It's hard to deal with something that large. A couple of observations I want to make. If we change race to ethnicity, if we don't change the attitude, nothing's going to change. I don't know, but you know, Brazil tried a process of marriage to get for everybody to look alike, and they still have problems. Ethnicity, I'm just using this word because you prefer it. The situation involved, and you pointed out, we were brought, my ancestors were brought not on our will, but because they needed someone to do the hard work. And at the beginning of the nation, when we adopted the Constitution of the United States, one of the great compromises was the 3/5 compromise, which meant that African slaves were 3/5 of white men. And that existed as the world until we had the Scott decision later on. And that decision came out that Africans in America, whether slave or free, had no rights that white men had to respect. And then in 1896, we had the Plessy decision, which created the separate but equal doctrine that unified. It was totally separate, but it was not equal in no way. So over 300 years, then that becomes a perception that different groups of people have. And that is something that it takes a lot of work to overcome. Then on the issue of nurture or nature, I think nurture has a greater impact on an individual because that's the teaching, the training, and the environment you live in, and not just your hereditary factors. I think there's a greater importance. I'm using two paradigms. One you use, President Obama. His father had hardly no impact on him. It was practical people from Kansas. I won't deal with the different racial groups they're involved in. That taught him. They taught him as if he was a white person. And the way he sees the world is totally different from the way I see the world because it was a different situation. When I graduated from college, we were doing the big civil rights fight. And you have, over that period of time, you have certain perceptions of other people, and other people have certain perceptions of you. And it really takes a lot of work to overcome that. So those are some of the realities that I've had to live with. And I've made this statement before. When I was in service in 1961, I was in Germany when the Second Berlin Crisis broke out. And everybody who was supposed to be, the term over there was over, they were extended. And they pulled in troops. And I thought we were going to have a fight. And I knew that the people we had fought in World War II or in Korea, if they came to the United States, they'd have more rights than I had. I had to try to decide what I was fighting because of patriotism And I finally concluded I'm fighting to stay alive. And if that helps, good. If it hurts, good. Because in reality, if I look at the facts, why was I fighting? So those are some of the things that my generation had come through. And I know we think blacks can dance real well, and I couldn't hardly dance. and the great athletes, I was clumsy, but a great athlete. So I think God had a better formula than we have. He created all different groups. They were probably equal divided between smart, not so smart, and some that was between. And we have messed up the situation because of the opportunities that African Americans have had and American Indians have had in America created the problem we have today. And even though my professor told me this back in 1960s, because even if you were trained in the United States, and he had a PhD from University of Chicago in jurisprudence, and we still have issues. When you're talking to culture, middle-class African Americans' culture is no different from whites. We were taught that in college, and my parents taught me that too, that I was no better and no worse than anyone else, and not to think I was better than anyone else because I went to college. So, I mean, those perceptions that our parents have is that nurture part. Now, I have another paradigm, is everyone knows Ron Kirk, former mayor of Dallas. Austin was a unique community historically in Texas because it was one of the only cities that I'm aware of that had an established African American class system. And Kirk was in that upper classes. His mother was a teacher and his father was a postal employee. And he finished high school in an integrated school in Austin. He went to Austin College in Sherman. Very few blacks had gone there at that time. And then he went to UT Law School. He never had a predominantly black job. He came out of law school as a lobbyist. So his experience was different from mine also. It wasn't that different as far as culture was concerned and expectation from parents. But my first job was with a black insurance company. And my second job was in teaching all black, predominantly black high school. And the third was with the government where I worked with everyone. But those are issues we can't just announce, like with the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, and the Fair Housing Act. We still have issues. And those issues and right now, it seems like it's reverting. And racism, and we were taught that if you're not in power, you may be a racist, but you can't do nothing about it. Because you can't impose that on nobody. But the people who are racist, like our president, he can make issues and make life terrible for people like us. So I thank you for delving into that. That's an issue I've delved in a master thesis, the potential of black in Houston. And my major professors gave me a hard time because I was black and I knew about it, but they wouldn't let me take credit. I didn't have a master's degree. If you get a master's degree, you were supposed to quote someone else to do that. So that was my big problem. So I thank you for the report, and I hope if we can just change the name and it works, I'd be glad to do that. Thank you.
Well, this is the kind of talk I come here for. I don't agree with a lot of people here, and I know a lot of people don't agree with me, but I value an intellectual discussion where we challenge one another and provide information. And Jian provided quite a bit of information, and I really do appreciate that. It was very well presented and very educational. I just wanted to point out that our founding fathers were vehemently against any kind of sectarianism. They had experienced plenty of that in Europe before they came over here to the States. And sectarianism can be likened pretty similarly to racism, I think, where one group thinks they're superior to the others. And Europe was full of situations where one group would get in control and they would try to wipe out the people that they disagreed with and stuff like that. And our founding fathers were vehemently against that. And it's already been acknowledged tonight that living in America gives you the opportunity to become whatever you want to be. Yes, there have been problems, there has been racism, there has been sectarianism, but our Constitution is blind to sectarianism and to racism. There was a situation during the Continental Congress where our founding fathers had to put in some provision for counting slaves as 3/5 of a person, but had they not done that, they wouldn't have been counted at all. So that was I think South Carolina was the state that was insisting on keeping slavery as an institution. But the point that I'm making is that our Constitution is colorblind and sectarian blind and has given us the seed of a system where we are able to get rid of racism and sectarianism. I mean, I don't think anybody would tolerate any sect, whatever it might be it Christian or atheist or anybody else, taking over our country and running this country according to their precepts. The precepts we've been given are in the Constitution, and the Constitution is colorblind and sectarian blind. And because of that, we have a free country where we can have discussions like this and nobody comes in and says, well, I don't agree with you, so I'm going to kill you all off and wipe you out. I mean, we're free to discuss things in a peaceful manner, and it's not everywhere in the world that you can do that. So I just want to say that I love this country, and I really appreciate what Jian said, and it thrills my heart to know that she can stand up here and say what she has to say, and John and everybody else can say whatever they want to say, and we all get along.
Man, there's some people waiting outside.
Well, anyway, Jan, I repeat, I really enjoyed that. I think that was very informative and very interesting. Actually, speaking English, I was, and of course in England, English is very important, and we love to use the language collect. Now, I do object to the term white, because actually when you look at the so-called white race, really it tends to be pink. And so, but if you go to countries like Finland, the people actually do look white. And there's a reason for that. It's because it's so cold for so long, the blood vessels are actually not close to the skin. And they actually do look quite ghostly, actually. So anyway, think about that. The thing I have noticed, actually, especially in the South, there are cultural similarities, actually, in the way people speak. For example, I noticed that everyone seems to use the word, use the double negative, like we don't care about nothing, or we don't want nothing, see, a lot. And so, but I think the real truth is that many times we see the politicians actually using the divide and conquer situation, and we see this now that colored people coming from the south of the border are seen as a threat. You see, but basically, what we do have, there is more of I think a kinship between the poorest of Americans, both white and anybody else. And I think they're in a similar situation, but they're divided because they're divided against one another for political purposes. And so that is very a very useful trick that gets played. So really,
I think this question of race and differences really is totally overplayed for political purposes. And of course that occurs in most countries. Now, in England, there's no, you don't, when you fill in the census, you don't put, your ethnicity, are you this color or that color? You're just, you're living there, you're just an English person. And so it's this, so you constantly see these differences in race being brought up over here. And I don't believe it's accidental. I think it's used for political purposes, which I just said. It's a matter of, dividing people against one another. And I think, I think, yes, there is opportunity in America. It's true. But that opportunity seems to be eliminated for the very poorest, actually, because the social network is so shattered these days. And of course, it's getting worse, and you see it in. But the biggest help, I think, is education, and what you see is the cost of it's going out of sight. And so I think, really, the sad thing is, I think the differences are increasing oftentimes. And the country, to progress, needs to go in the other direction, make these differences, more minimal. But what we've seen is inequality growing, and really, I don't think people living abroad realize how poor some Americans really are. I mean, if they really knew, they'd be astounded. I mean, you just don't see this level of poverty in many countries in Europe. You just don't see it. But here you do. And I think that's, that's part and parcel of this sort of ethnic divide that I think gets promoted over here. And I think that, as I say, there's a political reason for doing that.
Well, there's a very, very dark side to racism that I don't think we give enough time to thinking about, and that involves institutionalized racism or racism in government agencies. One event that brought this to light very much for me was something that happened down in Waco, Texas. That was a church community that was multiracial. Of the people who died at Mount Carmel, more than 50% were people of color. Yet your news media kept that from you. Your news media kept the fact of the multiracial character of that community was kept from you, and very few people of color were shown you in the media during that entire event. And it really brings a lot of questions to bear whether we have government agencies who are working as social watchdogs or cultural watchdogs who are enforcing a normality at a very great cost, really, to people's rights and so forth. So this is something to watch. For all the claims of racism that we get in the media based on a few words of someone, what you're not seeing is actually the bigger picture, and that is such things as the Greenwood Massacre up in the area of Tulsa, where by some accounts as many as 3,000 people were murdered up there outside of Tulsa in what they called a riot. And you never really got the news on that. You never saw the media on that. I've been working with some people who have researched that a bit. And you find out that wasn't the only incident, that there were several places in the country, in the 1920s especially, where you had some massacres, let's say, of, in this case, black people. And we don't get the news on that. We're not told about that. And so it's not even just regular citizens looking in the mirror if we look in the mirror, what we need to look in the mirror about is how we allow our elected officials and public servants to operate in a manner which we personally wouldn't choose and wouldn't support. Well, then why are we letting them get by with it, and why are we letting the media cover up such things?
Didn't know what this was going to go.
Going from. Hi, well, it's the first time I'm speaking here, so.
Can you adjust the mics, Tom?
Can you hear me?
Okay, speak up.
I just wanted to share my experience because I was not born in the U.S. But first I would like to say that race doesn't exist, racism does. Scientifically we know that race is just a social construct, and groups are created throughout history and then put against one another. I just wanted to remind, for example, the case of Hispanics. After the civil rights, there was integration of African Americans into schools, programs to help African Americans integrate, and Hispanics didn't belong anywhere. They were not getting the benefits of white Americans because they were not white, but they were not getting the benefits of African Americans because they were not black. So in 1970, there was a lawsuit, Cisneros v. Corpus Christi, and only after that lawsuit, it was decided that Hispanics was a group, an ethnic group that would. So it's just constructed by society. What I wanted to say also, just to give you my experience of the French system, is the system I know best. The government does not have the right to keep data about race or ethnicity in government data. It is illegal to ask for race. Recently, I read about a British student who came to Paris. I think he was doing some research, and his survey had a question about ethnicity or race. He was not allowed to do his research. It is illegal. And there were a number of laws that made it illegal to talk about race, to ask about race, to gather information about race and ethnicity in the public sphere. It doesn't mean that racism was eliminated, because there are people, not only laws, but at least the laws are very clear. Sorry?
Nothing.
My personal experience when I came to Texas and I was asked to fill out the forms when I got to the university, I didn't know which category I was in. And I was told, no, you have to put Caucasian. Until today, I don't know what Caucasian means. I'm a linguist, but I don't know what Caucasian means. So that's what I wanted to share.
Okay, I too think the Constitution is a very strong document. It's not supposed to be racist in any format, but it was immediately when they did 3/5, as far as I'm concerned. And just white cultures in general. Okay, you can say, oh, one's less racist than another. I grew up in Australia. It was not, and no one
ever cared what anyone's religion was. You didn't, take any notice of necessarily ethnicities per se, because most of us were white. Okay, and it wasn't until I left Australia and went to England in '69 that it took a Brit to actually tell me that there was a thing called the White Australian policy. Okay, which made no sense to me, because they said, oh yeah, no, only whites can go there, no Asians, blah, 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 which, made me question, well, how did the Chinese restaurants get there to begin with? And, the Indian restaurants, where I saw Indians, women in saris walking down the street, but they were very much a minority, obviously. So, all of this superiority to being white in general is very disturbing, okay? And yes, we are having a major rebound. Not that we ever really got over racism in this country, because no matter what laws were passed in the civil rights era, there was no funding to make them work in the final analysis anyhow and try and correct, the inequities that were obvious. And so I really think we are going backwards, because we have, someone in office that attempts to bring up the subject, whether it be racist, xenophobic, what have you, to his advantage. The most recent, of course, putting 2 of our own Congress people in the, and having the state of Israel withdraw visitors' visas to Congress people, which is an outrage. And I consider that also somewhat treasonous on his behalf. These are elected congressional figures. They have a right, we give funding to Israel. They have a right minimally to oversight, since we give funding to the state of Israel. So I don't know where this is all going to end. I do know what happened in El Paso 2 weeks ago is an outrage. And that's just being stirred. That pot is being stirred all the time. And Americans better get their heads on straight, okay? And really take a hard look at what road we are going down here, because it's a very, very dangerous one. And as much as I love this country, it's very disappointing to see what I truly do believe are the majority of good people, okay? But I would never say that the ones that are marching with tiki torches or wearing hoods or other such thing, or shooting up Walmarts are good people, okay? And those people are very weak people who are easily turned in a direction that someone with the pulpit can stir up. And nor do I believe that it's our media's fault, our typical hundreds of years established media's fault, okay, that this is all happening, okay? That same person thought nothing of using the media to self-promote when he was running for president anyhow. Now all of a sudden, that's the enemy of the people. These are very dangerous times and very dangerous words coming out of someone who should be uniting this country. So, anyhow. And by the way, Sean, I do believe that nurture is more important than nature, and also because of nurture and socioeconomic development, I think that has had a major impact even on nature in underprivileged countries. And one of the best examples of that would be North Korea, whereas the average height of the citizens, the births have changed because they're undernourished, period. So you do end up with a lot of potential impacts not only on how you look physically, but also even development, neurological and otherwise. Anyhow, thank you. It was a great talk, by the way.
I want to start with my Uncle Felix Martinez. He recently, at a birthday or Christmas or something, his daughter got him a genetic DNA test. And he's always thought he was Hispanic, Felix Martinez. And he found out he's predominantly Indian, which is, everybody thought, oh my God, who knew, So you don't really know without looking. I agree with the speaker. Lovely speech. Thank you. We are all part of the human race. And unfortunately now, we have people who are seen as who are being dehumanized. One of the stages of genocide is dehumanization, and that's happening in our government right now. I couldn't believe it was just now that El Paso was brought up, because it's such a current event and such a shocking, horrific event in a speech about racism. It's good to know, I think it is good to know your race for some reasons, medical reasons. And also, we have Gary Foster, who speaks here occasionally, and he's part Irish, half American Indian. And the Indians have to know their genetic, how much percentage Indian blood they have in order to get the funds that they have been allotted by the government. And cultural values are important. When I was in college, way back, I was a teenager, my late teens, and Alex Haley came, and he talked about roots, and that's before his book was even really out. And I just thought, oh my gosh, I was just mesmerized. I couldn't believe he knew all of these intricate details about his ancestry. And I thought, I don't really know what mine is. I'm just white, I'm Texan, that's all I ever thought of myself. And it's only till the past few years that I've started digging into my ancestry. And so far, I've only found white names. Holmes, Boyce, White, and Britton are the four names. So, but anyway, cultural values. I heard someone on public radio talking about the national parks. They had their 100th anniversary a couple of years ago. And they were saying that in some of the renovations and modernization of the park, they're taking cultural values into consideration, that Hispanic cultures, they said, predominantly do things in groups. And so they're having more settings that are, like a lot of us Anglos, we like to do things on our own. We hike, we bird watch, we do individual sports. But the Hispanics do things in groups. And after I heard that program, I go sit by the lake at White Rock Lake very often. And I noticed I even took pictures. There'd be a whole family, and some of them be on bicycles, some would be walking, but it would be the grandparents, the parents, and the little bitty kids in big groups. And this is, I thought maybe it was because they felt protected or something, but evidently this is just they value. They have a really strong, that's how they express family values. Maybe Americans, not that white people don't have them, but they certainly don't express them like that. We see ourselves as more independent. Also, the fact that you said culturally it's part of our race. I've always thought of myself as part Hispanic and part African American simply because I worked 13 years in Hispanic schools and 21 years in African American schools, predominantly African American. So I'm in that culture real thick, and they don't always accept me, but I see myself as partly being that. And we used to use the term the melting pot, but now we speak of it more as a mosaic. We are the human race, but it's good to be proud of your cultural values and know who you are, know your history and know who you are. Okay, question. Is Texas racist? The governor said after the shooting, this is not who we are. Excuse me, it is who we are. You know, this has gone on. This is the current horrific, probably the most horrific, I don't know for sure, but certainly in our country. And that's interesting that you pointed out the sectarianism. I did not know that as part of the history there. But we're founded on racism. I mean, some of the founding fathers bore children by their slaves so they could have more slaves to manage their farms. The Confederate flag, we have this big issue about the Confederate flag, and my family is real thick on these Confederate things. I'm not, but some of my family, my aunts and uncles and different ones are. And so I looked up Confederate flag, and what did I see but a white flag? And I think it had something blue in the corner. And there's 3 different flags that were considered the Confederate flag, but the one with the big X on it was the flag to symbolize the hatred, the racism. So that explains why African Americans and different people see that as disturbing, because it did. And maybe personally, some of you could see that, some of us see that as still believe that that's that myth, that's our pride and our history. But, you know, denial is very thick, very thick. An example of the denial that we have is one of my relatives, when Barack Obama was president, Michelle Obama, somebody took a picture and it was in one of these National Enquirers or something, and she had on a pair of slacks that were a little too tight, and they showed the seam of her undergarments. And she thought that was absolutely horrific. That is just, you know, disgraceful. Well, I asked her what did she think of the nude pictures of Melania that are on the website. You can see them on the internet. And she said, oh, well, she didn't do that when she was in the White House. As if that made a difference. I mean, the moral content there is striking. This is denial. It's really thick here. And we'd like to sit here and feel nice and cozy and comfortable and think everything is all right. And we should be proud of our country. But there's some horrible things going on. I was at a talk the other day, and a senator who had visited El Paso said he visited twice. And Jessica, I believe he said her name was Rodriguez, but she was one of the victims that was shot, and she was laying on the parking lot. She had been shot, and she was on the ground, and she saw the shooter shoot other people. And one woman was on the ground begging for her life, and he shot her in the head. You know, and the only reason these people were shot, he said, is because of their color, because they're Hispanic. I mean, how much more racist can you get? It's horrendous. I do know that as far as some of us having there's an element of fear of the unknown when we encounter other races. And last week I was at Richland College, and it was the first time I'd ever seen a woman from the Mideast that was completely head to toe covered in black. Her garments were totally black. You couldn't see her hands, you couldn't see her. I know she had something to be able to see out, but it looked like she was totally black. And she was kind of thin and kind of wiry, and she did like this with her remote control to do the car. And it scared me. I thought, you know that lady's not going to hurt you, and you would talk to her, but still there was an innate, just that really dark garment was scary to me. This is what they tell us is human nature. Human nature. But how we deal with that is a different thing. Does the light mean we're finished?
I don't know, but I know you've gone over 5 minutes. I know that.
Well, so did a lot of other people.
But not quite as much tonight.
Well, I'm going to say one more thing. Is Donald Trump a racist? Well, there's an article in the Atlantic magazine recently, and it has several pages of documentation of his life from way back when, starting in the 70s, where he was convicted of not letting African Americans rent in his properties, and not only African Americans, but blind people. They said he got in the elevator and he said, "What are those dots?" He was checking it out to see how they were modeling. He said, "What are those dots?" And they said, "Those are for the blind people." And he says, "Get those off of there. We're not having any of them in our building." You know, this is Donald Trump. He was convicted of, I forget what the term is, but anyway, discrimination. And he was under, they were watching him for a certain number of years, probation, and he was okay. But after that, he started in again. At his casino, when he and one of his former wives used to visit, he would have the African Americans taken out of the casino before he and she went in. What is that? That's racism. This is who, I mean, he has a long history, way back when, and people who know him know that he's racist. So what do you get in a country when you have a racist president? We have 78 hate groups in Texas. If you look at the Southern Poverty Law Center website, they have dots showing where all the hate groups are. Some of them are LGBT, some of them are Islamic, some of them are black nationalists, but predominantly it's the neo-Nazi groups. And we have a problem.
Good evening. I think we saved the best for last. I'm R. Nathan Brin. I'm a trial lawyer, 71 years old. I grew up in Dallas, Texas. I was born 2 blocks from the Alamo, Jewish to the core. I do get upset because my parents at one time were Democrats, and I saw and have seen what's happened.
Remember the Alamo!
A party that turned on us this year with supporters of the BDS, radicals, and leftists of the worst sort. The Jewish community, although many Democrats will say they're not going to change, not one damn dime to the demos anymore because of this, with those 4 women. You can call them the squad, or whatever else you want to. We call them trouble. Israel's a country of less. There are only 22 million Jews in the world. Yet we face constant discrimination we still have from the Grand Mufti of Egypt on to Adolf Hitler. We hear the same lies, and now we're hearing it coming from Washington from a couple of congresswomen who don't like us, but they liked our money They talked about Benjamins, but who took the Jewish Benjamins? The Democrats. Time, and I'll say this, I pray to God that not one self-respecting Jew gives one damn dime ever again to a Democrat till they get rid of the likes of the four in the so-called squad or squat and those so-called Genos, Jews in name only, like Chuck Schumer and Mr. Schiff. There are a few others I could name. What do they do? Bernie Sanders is another one. I don't think he's Jewish, but he claims he is. But the bottom line is, for those who've come along and supported this BDS garbage, and I call it horse manure, shame on you. And that's all I have to say. Understand I have a strong opinion, and I back it up against anyone. You all have a good evening. Thank you.
Win-win with Nathan Brown.
I think you could profit by actually reading Benjamin Netanyahu's letter of why he refused the two women to visit Israel. It's very informative because he actually said for one of the women that if under certain conditions she would be allowed to visit her relatives. But their itinerary, her grandmother, yeah. But their itinerary was one of basically, I'm going to have to translate it in my terms, is rabble-rousing and trying to incite. They were going to be getting with some groups who are associated with terror. So I think it was a very balanced letter, despite what our press has done over the matter.
I guess I'm the last one standing. I want to thank our speaker. I thought you did a terrific job here. I was all thinking, brought up some different things that are important for us to know. This country, as you mentioned, was formed by immigrants, and our history goes back to immigration. Our Constitution says that our Declaration of Independence and our Constitution are both involved in that we're all created equal, and so that there is really no racism there. We have not followed it the way we should, and I think that if it's one thing to remember is whenever the economy goes bad, there's always a rise of the lunatic fringe. That's something to remember. And right now we have a false economy with a lot of people out of work, and we have the rich doing very well, and everybody else in the middle okay, and then the bottom not doing well at all. And this has caused a lot of problems, and we have a leader that wants to divert our attention to other things. For example, just recently, because of what happened in El Paso, there's a lot of attention drawn to him, and he is diverting attention by talking about Greenland, trying to buy Greenland. So this is a new issue that comes up, and it's a way of diverting attention, if you think about it. And to get you away from the real issue and get you into phony issues. So my point is that we have to concentrate on the real issues. And the real issues in this country are economic. And that's where we need to try to get something better than we have now, so that we provide a better future for everybody in this country, instead of, I don't want to go into detail on this, but that's what we need. Anyway, without further ado, I give this back to our speaker. She did a great job.
Thank you. So I have the last word, right?
Yes, you do have the last word. You get the last word.
I have the last word.
Just respond to all this. Whatever you want to say.
I think sometimes when we go to the particulars, we have different opinions, and it's hard to bridge the differences. So I want to say something kind of general, like in a cross-cultural communication, one of the models is that we have 3 levels. At the bottom level is a humanity. So we all share our humanity. And at the second level is cultural differences. And the third level is the individual uniqueness, right? So if we go down deep enough, we see our humanity. And that's where we can try to overcome differences and communicate civilly, even if we have differences. At the second level, the cultural differences, like sometimes, as I say, as ethnic differences, because we are brought up in different cultural backgrounds, right? So even like people from New York, people from Texas, let alone like more diverse cultural backgrounds that make us different. And then at the top level is the individual uniqueness. And if you look at just at individual uniqueness and the cultural differences, this divide could be pretty big. And it's very hard to make people who think differently from you to agree with you. So now I don't even try to, because I know it's futile. I don't know whether it's good or bad, but at least like no one hates me here, because I am too. I'm kind of saying broadly, and I'm not being like too specific about particular issues or persons, right? But I think it's important to recognize that we are unique, but we are all part of human family. If we try harder to understand each other, then that's where the hope lies.
Well, that's it for tonight. Our speaker's here to talk to. Well, we're through.
I just had one more statement to make, but that's okay.
But she got the last word. That's it. You missed out. I stood up here trying to get you. Too late. Sorry. Tell her about it.
No, it's okay.
They kick us out of here at 10:30 when they close this place, and but we're through. Our formal meeting is over, and hope to see you all next week. And our speaker is still here if you want to talk to her. And thank you very much.